They told him to guard the broken machine gun like it was some kind of museum piece himself. The young soldiers laughed as they walked away, leaving the 70-year-old veteran standing alone in the desert heat next to a .50 caliber that hadn't fired in 3 weeks. One of them actually said it out loud enough for everyone to hear. He said the old man and the gun deserved each other, both relics that belonged in a scrapyard. But what those soldiers didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand in their arrogance, was that the quiet man in the worn red jacket, standing before that silent weapon, had built his entire career around making the impossible work when it mattered most. If you believe respect should be earned through action, not just words, stay with this story. His name was Robert Chen, though everyone who served with him decades ago called him Ghost. Not because he was quiet, but because he could make problems disappear. He'd retired from the Marine Corps 23 years earlier, after 30 years of service, most of it spent as a master armourer and weapons specialist. He'd volunteered for this civilian contractor position 6 months ago, not because he needed the money, but because sitting at home felt like dying slowly. His wife had passed 2 years before, and his children lived across the country with families of their own. The base needed experienced personnel, and Robert needed purpose. But from day one, the younger soldiers treated him like an inconvenience, a relic from a bygone era who moved too slowly and talked too little. The .50 caliber Browning had been giving them trouble for weeks. It would fire 3 rounds and jam, fire 5 and seize completely. The battalion armourer, a 26-year-old sergeant named Matthews, who'd been in service for 4 years, had declared it beyond field repair. He'd ordered a replacement from supply, but the paperwork was lost somewhere in the system, and the weapon sat in the maintenance area like a monument to bureaucratic failure. The unit was scheduled for a live fire exercise in 2 days, and they needed every weapon operational. That morning, the company commander had walked through the maintenance bay, seen Robert standing near the broken gun, and made a decision that was equal parts frustration and dismissal. The commander looked at Matthews and said to give the old man something to do, keep him out of the way. Matthews had grinned, that particular smile young men wear when they think they're clever, and told Robert his assignment was to guard the .50 cal, make sure nobody disturbed it until the replacement arrived. The other soldiers had laughed. One of them, a private first class named Rodriguez, had actually patted the gun and said it was perfect, 2 pieces of junk watching over each other. Robert had simply nodded, his sad, serious face showing nothing, the morning sun catching the white of his beard as he positioned himself beside the weapon. They'd all walked away then, heading to the functional weapons, leaving him alone in the corner of the maintenance area. Robert stood there for exactly 3 minutes after they left. Then he removed his red jacket, folded it carefully, and placed it on a nearby crate. He rolled up the sleeves of his plain grey t-shirt and approached the Browning like a surgeon approaching a patient. His hands, weathered and marked with decades of scars from hot metal and sharp edges, moved over the weapon with the kind of certainty that comes from having assembled and disassembled this exact model hundreds of times in conditions ranging from Arctic cold to desert heat. He didn't need the technical manual. The .50 caliber Browning M2 was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. He started with the basics, field stripping the weapon completely, laying each component out in precise order on a clean tarp he pulled from his pack. The bolt assembly came apart in his hands like it was eager to reveal its secrets. He examined each piece under the harsh sunlight, running his fingers over surfaces, feeling for the telltale roughness of metal fatigue or the sticky resistance of fouled mechanisms. The other soldiers had been treating symptoms, clearing jams and applying oil, but Robert was looking for the disease. End. He found it in the extractor, a hairline crack invisible to casual inspection, but obvious to fingers that had learned to read metal like Braille. The crack explained everything. The extractor couldn't maintain proper tension, causing inconsistent ejection that led to the cascading failures Matthews had documented. But a cracked extractor wasn't something you could fix with standard field tools, not according to current doctrine. Current doctrine said you tagged it, reported it, waited for parts or replacement. Current doctrine was written by people who'd never been in Robert's position 40 years ago in a firebase in a country that didn't officially exist, where the nearest supply depot was 3 days away and the enemy didn't care about your maintenance schedule. Robert had learned different doctrine then. The kind passed down from generation to generation of soldiers who understood that sometimes the book was a suggestion and survival was the only grade that mattered. He walked to his locker, the one the other contractors shared, and retrieved his personal tool kit. It was old, the leather case worn smooth, but the tools inside were immaculate, some of them modified in ways that would make a modern armourer raise eyebrows. He selected a small grinding stone, a set of precision files, and a bottle of compound he'd mixed himself decades ago. Back at the weapon, he began the delicate work of reshaping the extractor, removing microscopic amounts of metal to eliminate the stress point while maintaining the critical tolerances that made the mechanism function. His hands were steady despite his age, moving with the muscle memory of 10,000 previous repairs. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher. Sweat darkened his grey shirt, but Robert didn't pause. He reassembled the extractor assembly, tested the spring tension by feel, adjusted it twice more. Then he began putting the weapon back together, each piece sliding into place with the soft clicks and metallic whispers of proper fit. He checked the headspace with a gauge he kept in his kit, adjusted the timing, verified the feed mechanism. When the Browning was fully assembled, he loaded a belt of training ammunition, brass casings that gleamed in the sunlight, and charged the weapon. The bolt slammed forward with the sound of precision machinery doing exactly what it was designed to do. He was lining up on the test target when Matthews came around the corner. The sergeant stopped dead, his face cycling through confusion, irritation, and disbelief. He started to say something about unauthorized maintenance, about protocols, but Robert had already squeezed the trigger. The .50 caliber roared to life, the distinctive heavy rhythm that no other weapon could match, shells ejecting in a perfect arc, the weapon cycling through 20 rounds without hesitation. Robert released the trigger, cleared the weapon, and stepped back. The silence after that thunder was profound. Matthews approached slowly, staring at the Browning like it had transformed into something else entirely. He asked how Robert had done it, what parts he'd used, where he'd gotten authorization. Robert's response was quiet, his voice carrying the weight of experience. He said he'd fixed the extractor, that it had a stress fracture, causing the ejection failures, that he'd reshaped it using techniques he'd learned before Matthews was born. The sergeant started to argue, started to say something about regulations, but his words died when he saw the expression on Robert's face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pride. It was simply the look of a man who'd done what needed doing. Because that's what he'd always done. The company commander arrived 20 minutes later, brought by Matthews, who seemed unsure whether to report a problem or a solution. The commander, a captain named Williams who'd been in service for 8 years, looked at the weapon, looked at Robert, and asked for a demonstration. Robert loaded another belt and fired 50 rounds in controlled bursts, the weapon performing flawlessly, each round going exactly where it was supposed to go. When he finished, Williams asked the question everyone was thinking. He asked who Robert was, really, what his background was, because civilian contractors weren't supposed to have that kind of skill. Robert's answer was simple. He said he'd been a Marine, that he'd served as a master armourer, that he'd retired as a master gunnery sergeant. Williams went very still. In the Marine Corps, master gunnery sergeant is the pinnacle of enlisted expertise, a rank that carries more respect than many officer positions. Williams asked when Robert had served, where he'd deployed. The answer came in the same quiet voice. Vietnam, twice, Beirut, Grenada, Panama, the Gulf War. 30 years of service, most of it spent keeping weapons running when failure meant lives lost. He'd been the armourer for Force Recon units, for Marine Expeditionary units, for classified operations he still couldn't talk about. He'd trained 3 generations of armourers, written sections of maintenance manuals, developed field-expedient repair techniques that were still being taught even if nobody remembered who'd invented them. Williams stood at attention. Then, something he didn't have to do for a retired enlisted man, but something respect demanded. He apologised, not just for the morning but for the 6 months of dismissal, for treating experience like irrelevance. He asked why Robert hadn't said anything, hadn't mentioned his background. Robert's response cut through everything. He said he had mentioned it, in his application, in his initial interview, but nobody had bothered to read past his age. They'd seen 70 years old and assumed limitation instead of expertise. They'd looked at his worn jacket and sad face, and seen someone to tolerate rather than someone to learn from. Matthews had gone pale during this exchange. He stammered an apology, said he hadn't known, hadn't understood. Robert looked at him then, and his expression softened slightly. He said that was the problem, that not knowing and not bothering to find out were 2 different things, that the military taught people to respect rank and position, but sometimes forgot to teach them to respect experience and capability. He said every person they met had a story, had skills, had value, and dismissing someone because they didn't fit expectations was a failure of leadership and character. Williams made immediate changes. He called a company formation that afternoon and introduced Robert properly, reciting his service record, his qualifications, his expertise. He announced that Robert would be taking over as the senior armourer for the unit, that his recommendations would carry the weight of orders, that anyone who had a problem with that could discuss it with the captain personally. The soldiers stood in formation, many of them looking at the ground, shame written on young faces that had learned a hard lesson about judgment. Rodriguez, the private who'd made the comment about junk, asked permission to speak. When Williams nodded, Rodriguez apologised directly. To Robert said he'd been disrespectful and wrong, said he hoped he could learn from someone with that kind of experience. Robert accepted the apology with a nod, then spent the rest of that day teaching Matthews and 3 other armourers the techniques he'd used on the .50 caliber. He showed them how to diagnose problems by sound and feel, how to identify stress fractures before they became failures, how to make field-expedient repairs that would hold until proper parts arrived. He taught them tricks he'd learned in places they'd only read about, techniques passed down from armourers who'd served in wars their grandparents had fought. The young soldiers listened with the intensity of people who'd realised they'd almost missed something valuable. The live fire exercise 2 days later went perfectly. Every weapon functioned flawlessly because Robert had spent 48 hours inspecting each one, making minor adjustments, catching small problems before they became major failures. Williams wrote a commendation for Robert's file and sent a letter to the contracting company explaining that they had a master armourer on staff and should be paying him accordingly. More importantly, the culture in that unit shifted. Soldiers started asking Robert questions, seeking his advice, treating him like the resource he'd always been. The maintenance bay became a classroom where experience flowed from one generation to the next. 6 months later, when Robert's contract came up for renewal, Williams personally asked him to stay, said the unit needed him, that he'd become invaluable. Robert agreed, not because of the pay increase the contracting company offered, but because he'd found what he'd been looking for when he'd first volunteered. He'd found purpose, respect, and the satisfaction of knowing his skills still mattered. He continued wearing his red jacket, continued maintaining his serious expression, but now, when he walked through the base, soldiers stopped to greet him, to ask questions, to learn from someone who'd earned his expertise through decades of service. The .50 caliber Browning that had started everything remained in service, firing tens of thousands of rounds over the following years. Matthews had a small plaque made and attached it to the weapon's mounting bracket. It read "Ghost's Gun," a tribute to the man who'd proven that experience and skill don't expire with age. that judgment based on appearance is always a mistake, and that sometimes the person everyone dismisses is exactly the person everyone needs. Robert never mentioned the plaque, but those who knew him well noticed he always took special care of that particular weapon, maintaining it with the same precision and dedication he'd shown that first day when they'd left him, to guard it as an insult, and he'd returned it to service as a lesson in respect.